With that, I will now go to Jonathan, who will guide you through the first panel. Jonathan.
Thank you, Jonathan, and a warm welcome to our distinguished panelists today and all of you joining us. I'm Jonathan Papalides from Food for the Hungry, and on behalf of FH, we are delighted to be co-hosting today's event with the OECD and with Jonathan Marley. Today's conversation takes place against the backdrop of an ongoing global pandemic, increasing economic volatility and price shocks, increasing conflict around the world, and worsening climate change and disasters. And all of these impacts are felt the most in the world's most fragile contexts, which even before COVID-19, a staggering 80% of the world's extreme poor were estimated to live in by 2030, the endpoint of the SDGs. So given this predicament and fragility, many in the development community have called for new ways of thinking and working to help address those in the hardest places. And we see missing from this debate the importance of the revisiting and reimagining of a state building approach for these contexts. The OECD's major group of donors, the Development Assistance Committee, over 10 years ago, issued a set of principles for good international engagement in fragile contexts, which said that state building should be the central objective of international engagement and cooperation in fragile places. Now, at the time, the vision that the OECD DAC expressed for how to do state building was compelling and prescient. It talked about the need to support resilient states and often equated state building with the idea of developing state resilience. It saw these as synonyms. The idea behind this was that if the state's institutions and processes and systems and capacities could be strengthened in a way that was closely involving society, then it could develop a sense of resilience, both on the political side, a political resilience that could adapt and channel grievances and conflict in ways that were peaceable and did not lead to violent conflict. On the other side, this vision said that where states can help foster societal or developmental resilience, it could protect markets through major price shocks and bust and boom cycles. And it could also protect society, including the most vulnerable, from disease outbreaks, from disasters, from instability, and so forth, and from extreme poverty. And so this vision of a resilient state approach was very, very compelling. But at the time, using resilience to define a state building approach was not very mainstream. And in fact, most of the conversations around resilience were relegated to specific sectors. So if we said resilience, we would think about food security or disaster risk reduction or climate adaptation. But we would not think about a holistic approach to countries whereby state building processes could develop a resilience that was so important to basically deal with looming risks and crises that were characteristic and defining features of fragile places. So instead, a lot of the discourse at the time tended to focus on issues of sequencing. What do we put first in state building agendas? Does political settlements come first, followed by security and basic services? Or do economic reforms come first, followed by security and so forth? The debates were very much around how to sequence different reforms without looking at the characteristics of those reforms. So we had essentially a needs-based approach to state building, whereby we were focusing on economic growth and poverty reduction, but we were not focusing on top-line risks and building capacities through the state's institutions and processes to manage these risks. Now, fast forwarding to today, we see what we call an emerging fragility to resilience paradigm shift in the aid community. We see the US government's global fragility strategy focusing heavily on resilience, as is the European Union's strategic approach to resilience plan. We see the new World Bank and IMF strategies for fragility talking squarely about resilience. We see a second iteration coming up from the African Development Bank's fragility to resilience strategies as well. And we see the UN system increasingly incorporating a resilience approach across many of its entities to focus on these issues. So now is the time, we believe, to now revisit this idea of a resilient state building approach, where we have more assessments, strategies, consensus, and resource commitments behind this idea of resilience. Now, that said, we are still very much in an emerging phase where we're still trying to crystallize the implications and the processes for doing this work better. So to help us today, we've assembled some of the world's leaders, practitioners, thinkers, and researchers to help us get insights into how to address and move forward a resilient state building agenda. So we'll be looking to our two panels to help us do this. But underlying this entire issue, of course, is not just developing a better approach to state building. It's also trying to rethink how we come together and work more effectively as an international community with governments and with societies. Too often when we look off into fragile contexts, we see aid delivered through short-term, one-off and disjointed projects and scattered assistance in the face of systemic breakdowns in institutions and markets and societal relationships. And so we need a new way of working that we can solve collective action problems together through. Now, over the last few years, we've seen an emerging consensus led by the OECD and the World Bank and parts of the UN system, as well as the G20, to call for what we call country platforms. Now, these are government-led bodies that bring together donors, international partners, societal stakeholders to help solve collective action problems, promote political and policy dialogue, and cultivate a sense of mutual accountability as a way of being able to promote a state building process moving forward and also adapt better to shocks and stress. So as we look to our panels today to help give insights in terms of how we move forward on a resilient approach to state building, we'll also be asking them to think about new ways of cooperation in these hard places, including possibly through the country platforms. Now, I should say that country platforms are not new in the sense that they've never been tried before. They've actually been tried for the last 20 years in a variety of different contexts. And we see evidence from Somalia and Niger and Liberia and other contexts that they've actually worked quite well in moving forward more collectively towards an exit to fragility. But these are amongst the most under-examined and unevaluated processes in the aid community. So as we think about resilient state building, we also must be thinking about how we take advantage of the consensus now to invest in more country platforms as a vehicle for this more resilient state building approach. And with that, I'm delighted to introduce our first panel, starting with Nabila Tounes, who is the Minister of the Western Region for Sierra Leone. She was previously Foreign Minister of the country and the Minister of Planning and Economic Affairs. So a very warm welcome to you, Minister Tounes. We have Hannah Tete, who is the Special Representative of the Secretary General for the African Union and has had a distinguished career, including as the Foreign Minister of Ghana and former Minister of Trade and Commerce for the country. She is also taking on a very exciting new assignment next month for the UN as the Special Envoy for the Horn of Africa. So we're delighted to welcome you here and we're wishing you all the best in the new assignment as well. We have Sam Hickey, who is Professor of Politics and Development at the Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester, and for who a decade led the Effective States and Inclusive Development Consortium partners. Today, he's the Deputy CEO of the African Research Consortium for Cities, which is both doing exciting work in the space of resilience, as did the Coalition on Effective States and Inclusive Development. So a warm welcome to you. And we have Marika Shomaris, who is the Vice President of the Busara Center, doing leading work on behavioral research and insights to some of the most pressing development challenges in Africa, which also involves resilience. And before that, Marika was the head of politics and governance at the Overseas Development Institute and the research director for the Secure Livelihoods Research Consortium, another decades-long research initiative looking at issues of state legitimacy, service delivery, resilient livelihoods, and coping capacities. So a very warm welcome to you, Marika, and I hope that you'll plug the book during your remarks for the SRC that you just have coming out. So with that, I would like to pose the first question to Minister Tounes. Madam Minister, Sierra Leone has, of course, gone through several episodes of crises and conflict in its past, and it's increasingly shown great resilience to a lot of these crises. Can you give us a sense of how the government has increasingly made clear the types of risks that it needs to focus on and the kinds of adaptations that it's taken to promote both a sense of political resilience, but also the societal resilience as well as you've been in your positions?
Sorry, I'm having I'm having some internet issues here.
Sure.
Could you repeat that? Yes, could you repeat that, please?
Sure. Can you give us an overview sense of how Sierra Leone has been able to adapt, both in terms of political resilience as well as societal resilience, to many of the challenges and the risks and crises that the country has faced over the many years? Can you give us a sense of how you've been doing essentially a resilient state building approach?
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you from wherever you are around the world. And first of all, let me register my profound thanks and appreciation to the organizers of this virtual event to revisit our approaches to state strengthening in fragile context. And there's no better time to do this and recalibrate our joint efforts to address fragility in low-income countries, than in the current global context where fragile states across the world continue to face debilitating socioeconomic and environmental challenges, which since I should say 2019 has been exacerbated by the COVID pandemic and its concomitant effects on the lives of people, especially those living in low-income countries. In Sierra Leone, basically, we have made, some progress in terms of, restructuring a resilient economy and support groups in the face of complex risks and crises. And I would first of all point, at the natural ability, the natural adaptability of qualities of the average Sierra Leonean, to adapt, to changing circumstances. And irrespective of the nature of a challenge or adversity, Sierra Leone, the average Sierra Leonean has the natural ability to turn, such a challenge into somehow a stepping stone for finding solutions, or turning it into full-blown opportunity. So we have the inherent natural trait in us to really, address and overcome challenges. And you must know that we would refer to the war. We would also refer to Ebola and now COVID. But over and above this natural tendency of the individual Sierra Leonean to overcome obstacles, over 60 years of self-rule as a country has really taught us valuable lessons in terms of addressing shocks and stressors. We have realized that as a country, party politics is more than anything else is responsible for some of the divisions that sometimes lead to tensions within the country. And often the winner-takes-all approach to elections, tends to fuel animosity and discontent. And currently, government is working consciously, to make governance inclusive and participatory across, all divides. Another thing that government has done is to set up an independent commission for peace and national cohesion to address some of the sticky areas that pose a threat to stability. And, as a country, we strongly believe, that building structures and institutions that work and reflect the desires of the people is the first step towards tackling shocks even before they happen. So since the end of the civil conflict in 2002, successive governments, including our development partners, have invested significantly, in this establishment of peace building, democratic as well as sustainable development institutions across all sectors. If we take a look at the justice sector as well, it has been considerably reformed and strengthened to dispense justice swiftly and equitably. We also have other community-led initiatives of peaceful settlement of family land disputes and other minor cases, which have been supported by the central government in some communities across the country. In terms of transparency, we look at the anti-graft institution, which has been established and strengthened and given enormous powers to effectively investigate and prosecute cases of corruption across the country. And the work of the ACC over the past 4 years has not only closed leakages that previously costed our country millions of dollars, but it's also led to the recovery of colossal sums of money, from government officials and unscrupulous private sector operatives. In looking at the government's economic diversification policies as well, the current economic diversification policies will ultimately ensure that the country is also not vulnerable to economic shocks that often occur, when global prices slump for one commodity on which a particular country squarely lies on, as this was the case, with iron ore in 2014 that led to an abrupt halt in what was an impressive growth at that time. So with our economic diversification into areas, the agricultural sector, tourism as well, will ensure that in case of such eventuality, the country has other viable sectors to fall back on. We've also worked on a very close partnership with the West African Regional Bloc, ECOWAS, to establish a multi-sector early warning center that is responsible for analyzing various socio-economic, political, health, and other emerging issues, with a view of identifying possible areas of frictions, outbreaks, or economic downturn that may have major consequences on the country and its neighbors as well. In terms of our focus as a government and where we have come from, what we have done is to establish a people-centered approach, and forming partnerships across the board has been really critical in terms of how we build the resilience. And what we have done through the formation of the ministry that I now lead, which is the Ministry of the Western Region, it's aimed at bolstering inclusive government, which focuses on the people. And with this new entity, it's been pivotal really in taking governance to the people and vice versa. So through the Ministry of the Western Region, it takes that additional layer of creating horizontal and vertical partnerships with the people who are really, the center of any intervention, and are also the center of building resilience within our national context. And the ministry provides a unique opportunity for deeper engagement at all levels. And it also provides the platform for meaningful inputs from, the people, the ordinary people, to ensure that we drive a people-centered policy and, for engagement across all sectors, which is also aimed at building the resilience that we certainly need. In terms of our relationship and partnerships at the international level, we are quite grateful that the challenges at the height of the pandemic in 2020, we are aware that almost all economies in fragile states had shrunk, by an average of 2%. And it also greatly undermined the capabilities and the capacity of these countries to put up a strong resistance, against the spread of the disease. But what I want to focus on is that, the great job that was done by countries, those that are still in fragility, like ours, who are walking out of it. The great job that was done in rolling back, the spread of the pandemic, and the efforts of these countries really saved thousands of lives, as against the high numbers of fatalities that were predicted by experts. And these are things that we really need to focus on: what kind of internal mechanisms were built, and what structures were utilized to build back better and strengthen resilience within the country level. And this is something that Sierra Leone has learned from, and legislatures that were quite swift in addressing, some of the core issues during, these quite challenging times, were also helpful in gaining that consistency and that collaboration that was needed, to provide the country with that basic strength and resilience that was needed for us to deal with the pandemic itself. And it gave the central government to also have the authority to implement lockdowns, to carry out contact tracings and conduct quarantines where necessary. And in all of this, the people were at the center, leading and sharing information that helped to give government, the requisite tools it needed to address the issue. So, bylaws, looking at bylaws at sub-national levels, even countries such as Djibouti and Burundi, did not only ensure that local leaders were at the center of the decision making, but they were also included in the processes itself. And as we have learned over the years, since the war days, this kind of participatory approach is quite crucial for achieving sustainability in our development endeavors, and it also helps to engender resilience. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Minister Tunis. That was a masterclass in looking at how you've done resilience, building on the self-efficacy and internal resilience of people, and then bringing in a web of networks and institutions that can be responsive at different levels, clearing certain regulations and rules to be able to empower different parts of the government to respond quickly, and also balance out the tensions of elections, also with certain kinds of commissions and dialogues that will also promote coming together as well. And so this is great. Also very interesting to see how ECOWAS has played a role in helping make more visible various complex risks that could be looming in ways that perhaps isn't always apparent within the country. So that's been wonderful. Let me ask a quick follow-up question. When it comes to the idea of this country platform, the president announced several years ago that they would set up a country platform, an architecture for coordination that would bring various partners together so that there wouldn't be this sort of piecemeal approach to aid in the country. Can you give us a perspective on if and how that's been working?
I'm sorry, I missed you again. The internet's a bit poor today.
Sure, no worries. So I was asking the question about how Sierra Leone may have already been addressing some of the piecemealness of development work in the country. And several years ago, the president announced the creation of this aid architecture, this country platform that would bring various partners together in a way that also would include various municipalities into an overarching structure. Can you give us a sense if that structure has been helpful, if it's been working, if it has potential?
Yes, thank you very much. We are working with the structure, and I always use my ministry as an example of the interventions that government has made, across the board towards ensuring, that country platforms that involve international partners, government ministries, local authorities, and civil societies, do work. And having the partnership at that level is quite critical. And certainly, yes, it has been very useful in Sierra Leone here. I would love to highlight the challenges that we have been going through, because obviously we do understand that COVID is still very much present, and we now have a few other instances, a few other conflicts that tend to threaten the resilience and the posturing that we have set out for ourselves. Because as a developing country, I must say, that is walking out of fragility, we do rely heavily on our partnership with the international partners. So what we are focusing on is how can we continue to ensure that these platforms are much more meaningful in terms of not only the discourse, but in terms of intervention. We also understand that the global context, the space is becoming increasingly limited for the kind of partnerships that we would like to have that would really propel the country above that level. And we do see, probably not really deliberately, but it is becoming increasingly difficult for what we refer to as better placed nations, to kind of live up to certain obligations that have been made, and responsibilities to provide targeted support, to low-income countries like ours to mitigate, impact of climate change on vulnerable communities. And we also see the inadequate investment opportunity for institutional strengthening. But within the country itself, we're in the process of doing a fragility assessment, and the integrated national financing framework as well activities that are in progress. We had the focus on the private sector, and we are trying through various levels to increase the relationship with private sector, because as a government, His Excellency the President believes it's the way to go. However, here it is yet to take off fully and contribute to the economic prosperity drive of the government, but certainly the building blocks have been put in place, and we are making slow but steady progress in that regard through the ministry, which I am shepherding at the moment. We have been able to create relationships across the board, because we do have the convening authority as well, even though it focuses on what is happening in the Western region, which is also the seat of governance, and it's a cosmopolitan area which basically provides that foundation. It is also an opportunity where we have brought together, different actors, reaching out to all sectors to ensure that the potentials, how the international community can really come in and support, this resilient and inclusive agenda for state and system strengthening is also met. So there are different layers, different approaches to ensure that as a country, we really do build back better and we're more resilient. And it's more or less reaching out to all sorts of partnerships at all levels, but at the center of the partnerships are bringing the people themselves on board, because there's this focus now inwardly. How could we build the resilience from within and prepare the country better for future shocks, if any?
Thank you so much, Minister June. It's very valuable. And in fact, Sierra Leone's country platform is one of the very few that has connections to municipalities and local levels as well, feeding into the structure. So very interesting. Delighted for these comments. We know that you might not be able to stay for the entire session, so we'll thank you now for participation, and we'll welcome one of your designates to come after you need to go. So thank you so much for that. Turning now to SRSG Tete, a warm welcome to you today. You've been a champion of resilience throughout your entire tenure in UN positions and beyond, and recently talked about how in the Sahel, there needs to be much more of a multidimensional resilience approach that looks at climate, that looks at COVID, that looks at conflict dimensions together. I talked earlier on about this slow march, this emerging paradigm from fragility to resilience, and I'm curious, to what extent are you seeing this type of paradigm shift happening with your interlocutors, within governments, within other partners? Are we getting there? Does it look like resilience is really bubbling into the kinds of policy and political discourse you're having? Or is it still a very new concept that has potential, but it hasn't fully sunken in yet? So that's the one question. And the other one would be, how do we as an aid community and perhaps the UN system directly better support different kinds of coordination and collaboration to make a resilience approach more of a reality, including potentially through country platforms?
Thank you very much. Thank you also for having invited me to be part of this discussion. Good afternoon, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, and my colleague panelists. And once again, thank you for those introductory questions. From the UN perspective, and this is particularly the approach that has been taken by UNDP, we look at resilience as the ability to identify and stay away from risks, and when risks become shocks, the capacity to cope, to adapt to them, or to reshape them. And so in the process of building resilient states, what we're looking to do is to support and I'm focusing my remarks particularly on Africa, is to support the nations on the continent to be able to build this into their institutional and governance systems, so that as we increasingly see the greater impact of climate change, natural disasters, and of course, all of the other things that we cannot predict, like the pandemics and conflict and the shocks that it brings about, that countries are better placed to be able to have prepared in advance to be able to respond to these situations as they arise. But having said that, Africa has a very significant challenge in being able to do that in an effective way. Now, as I'm sure is well known to everybody who is on this discussion at the moment, a number of African countries have been beset by severe economic challenges that have been exacerbated by COVID and are now being further exacerbated by the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. The recovery from COVID was fragile, and at the point at which people began to have some optimism that we were now moving towards regaining some of the growth that had been lost over the last 2 years. Now the conflict has kicked in, and with its impact on commodity prices and especially food prices and fuel prices, there is no doubt that this is going to have a significant impact in the years to come. And we don't even know the extent to which this will impact us yet. But a rapid assessment of the situation created by the conflict in Ukraine by UNCTAD indicates that Egypt, Sudan, Tunisia, and Morocco will be significantly affected because of their dependence on imports of agri-food products coming out of Russia and Ukraine. Between 2018 and 2020, Africa imported $3.7 billion worth of wheat, which represents 32% of the continent's total wheat imports from Russia, and another 1.4 billion that represents 12% of the continent's total wheat imports from Ukraine. And of course, as I just mentioned, looking at the increase in the price of oil and the fact that not that many African states are oil producing countries, this is undoubtedly going to impact the price of food, fuel, and the macroeconomic tightening would put pressure on households and also put pressure on national economies. I was just home in Ghana last week, and I could immediately see that beginning to happen. In addition to that, Africa has 33 out of the world's 46 LDCs. And essentially that indicates that 2/3 of the 54 countries of the continent, as recognized by the UN and 55 by the African Union, fall into the category of states that are going to have to make sure that in their planning, they make sure that they take into consideration resilience in order to protect themselves from the worst of these shocks. And as you mentioned, the previous discussion that I was involved in the Sahel, I think that it's important to note that the Sahel region is perhaps the most vulnerable of the regions on the continent to exactly these kind of shocks. And by the Sahel in this instance, I'm referring to the geographical region stretching from Senegal and Gambia on the west coast of Africa to Chad in the Central African region. The entire Sahel region, interdependent factors such as extreme poverty, climate change, armed conflict, and insecurity are driving the staggering levels of structural, chronic, and acute vulnerabilities. Over the last year, we've seen 4 unconstitutional changes of government within this region, and that is an indication of the pressure that is being felt. We have also seen the challenge of increased terrorism, violent extremism. We've seen the consequent transnational crime that comes with human trafficking. Again, a lot of it is emanating from this space. So the discussion we're having this afternoon on fragility, I think, for all of these reasons, is particularly pertinent. Now, I think it's important that to note that while as an international community, we can be supportive of states' efforts to be able to build resilience into their responses, it is important that there has to be national ownership. Because without that, we're not going to get the translation of policy, programs, and support into action and execution. And while it's useful to have collaborative platforms at the country level, at the national level, it's also in some context where you see these interconnected developments to have those collaborative platforms at the regional level as well. But the challenge with having these collaborative platforms, whether at the regional level or at the country level, is that there's always the need to promote better coordination, to make sure that there are no offshoots of ongoing programs and initiatives that only creates more programs and initiatives, but not necessarily a coherence in planning responses. Because it's also important to recognize that with a number of these fragile states, they are also they are also characterized by having low absorptive capacity, weak internal coordination mechanisms, and the inability to ensure coherence with national development issues. We just heard from the Minister of Sierra Leone, and I think what they've been able to do, translating the work done at national level and have it decentralized and take it further down such that it is felt across the country, is important in making sure that we move from thought to action to execution. And I think that has to be the focus of whatever we're doing when we're looking at working within the structure of national platforms or regional platforms in order to be able to have an effective response. But I would also say that that does not mean that we need to take away the focus from poverty reduction, good governance, promoting democracy as a tool for ensuring legitimacy and accountability. And I especially would like to emphasize the part about democracy as a tool for legitimacy and accountability. Again, if we look at what's happened with the coups d'etats that have taken place recently, specifically in Guinea, there was an issue of legitimacy and accountability, especially with the former president's adoption of his third-term agenda, changing the constitution in ways that were questionable, and ultimately it impacting in an uprising that was popularly supported by many within the country. And so while we work with political leadership, and we tend to emphasize the importance of having effective relationships with the political leadership, I think it's important that within that context, we also focus on the need to making sure that that political leadership is accountable, that governance, institutions, and structures indeed are managed in such a way that they provide the opportunity for competition, for contest, but at the same time for people to make their views felt in whatever platform we're talking about. And I don't want to go into the details of the different government institutions and how these can be tweaked to be more effective. But I think it's important to remember that, because part of the challenge that we're having, I think, is a crisis of legitimacy and accountability in the democratic governance structures that increasingly have replaced autocracies on the continent. But at the same time, because democracy is not seen as delivering the development dividend, their usefulness is being called into question. But when democracies function effectively, indeed, they are effective platforms for building this resilient response. And that's the reason why we have to continue to encourage the strengthening of democracy, the strengthening of institutions, but making sure that these institutions are both legitimate in the sense that there's national acceptance and ownership that these are the leaders that we have chosen, and accountable to the people who have voted for them. I'd also like, on the question that you raised regarding working together within the context of these national platforms, and I talked about having both national and regional platforms. They are effective vehicles for building a resilience response, but to the extent, and I want to emphasize that there is national ownership and national leadership. And that must reflect in the way in which the resilience strategy is in and of itself developed. But while emphasizing the need for national ownership and national leadership, I'd also like to emphasize the need for inclusivity, because we see national platforms as an opportunity for the government, for the private sector, for civil society, for development partners to get together. But we must interrogate those headlines a bit more. Because when we talk about civil society, what do we mean? In the context of our continent, we have states that are generally multi-ethnic, multicultural, and multi-religious. And therefore, the diversity in and of itself requires that inclusive platforms don't just look within these broad headings, but make sure that all groups, dominant groups and minority groups, find a way to have their views expressed within the context of those national platforms. And while political parties, and it goes back to the issue again of the kind of democracies we have sometimes been, in the way in which they mobilize on ethnic grounds, some of the drivers of conflict, it is precisely for that reason that the political diversity must also be reflected on national platforms. so that they also have to be part of the discussion, and they also have to take responsibility for making sure that the country that they hope to govern indeed is a country that remains whole and continues to strengthen and doesn't have its indicators deteriorating further. And I'd like to end by saying that regional platforms, such as those created by the ECOWAS early warning mechanism, which also exist within the AU because they also have early warning mechanisms, are only useful to the extent that early warning translates into early action. I don't think that we have a challenge with access to information and indicators of where we see the trouble spots on the horizon. What has been the challenge in a number of states has been the political will to be able to take the necessary action and have the resilient response to make sure that shocks can be addressed as they occurred and they can be adapted to. And I think that one of the challenges that I have seen, especially over the last 3 years as I have worked as the special representative to the African Union, has been not lack of early warning mechanisms, but the lack of taking the information that comes out of that analysis, using the vehicle of these national platforms or whatever other structures exist, for countries to take a hard look at themselves and to say, what do we need to do differently in order to make sure that we can avert the next crisis? So let us take an approach that allows country leadership to lead, but let us also make it clear that development assistance comes with a requirement for inclusivity, accountability, execution, decentralization, and making sure that we are able to move from discussion to concrete actions in order to build the resilience that we are all seeking to promote. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Madam Tete, for those exceptional remarks. The point is very well taken about the need to have platforms be nationally owned and driven, and also that the platforms themselves would contribute to more inclusive institutions within society, not just being able to represent a group within platforms that are inclusive, but also building those institutions in society that are meant to be more serviceable to a wider group of populations, including those that are excluded. And so the platforms need to exist within a broader ecosystem of work that's happening at multiple levels, from regional to national to subnational, that's promoting this more equitable state. When you mentioned democracy as a key element of resilience, I also thought of the recent Club de Madrid Global Commission on Democracies and Emergencies that are very much looking right now at the resilience aspects of democracy. So I think this is a very important insight as well that you're giving us. When we look at the Somalia country platform, and we have Shamar Kaithera on the second panel, we recently did a conversation at the Center for Global Development on the platform. It was clear that in the beginning, it was very much populated with donor interests, with development partners, priorities, and projects. But over the course of a long-term engagement stretching a decade, the government increasingly inserted its own agenda and began a process of learning by doing, so that now it's the one writing various policies and prescriptions. And there were two nascent institutions that were created on the side of the platforms, in part responding to the platforms, one for national security and one for national planning, that involved all the mayors and the subnational areas too. So still very early days for Somalia in the face of significant challenges, but there has been a lot of evidence to show that these platforms are capable of promoting local institutions, of empowering national ownership and leadership over the cause. And so all of your points are very well taken and connect to a much broader discourse. So we thank you very much. Let me turn now to Sam Hickey for your thoughts. You've led this Effective States and Inclusive Development Consortium over a decade, and now are looking at the role of cities in building resilience and state capacity and inclusive development. What insights come out for you in this discussion around resilient state building, in response to also Minister Tunis's remarks and Madam Tete's?
Thanks, Jonathan, and thanks for the invitation to such an august panel. I wanted to reflect briefly on the way in which the previous two speakers flagged the current crisis in Ukraine as providing important context to our discussions, rightly so, obviously, in the context of fragility and resilience. One of the things I want to talk about is the effectiveness of external efforts to promote state building. And these have historically been tied to a wider effort to globalise a particular form of liberalism that has arguably been in retreat for some time now, when you see the rise of populist authoritarianism and so on. And the response to Russia's invasion has been interesting in this respect, and has been heralded by some as marking a rebirth of liberalism and a new confidence in the West. And that might be so, but I guess we should be cautious here. It seems that half of the countries on OECD's list of states of fragility either voted against the UN resolution condemning the Russian invasion, or abstained or didn't vote, 26 of the 57. And so it just reminds us that the global politics of state building in our increasingly bipolar world remains a really highly contested ideological endeavour. And that provides some framing for some of the findings that we generated through the Effective States and Inclusive Development Research Centre. So we were looking at these issues of ownership that Madame Tate just raised. Under what political conditions do political rulers become committed and generate state capacity to deliver developments? That was our question. And we looked at this across a whole range of policy domains: economic growth, natural resource governance, social services, gender equity, and direct efforts to build state capacity across a whole range of over 50 countries. And we came up with 3 C's as our sort of main findings: context, coalitions, and capacity as being the keys to understanding when elite commitment and state capacity emerges. And in terms of context, what we found was that what matters most in shaping elite commitment and state capacity is the political settlements in particular contexts. And this helps reveal what kinds of different pathways there are to state building and development in the global South. So we found that the incentives for leaders to invest in inclusive development initiatives, such as social protection, a key element of building resilience, was very different in different types of political settlements. In competitive settlements like Ghana, Kenya, elections eventually became an important driver of cash transfer programs becoming institutionalized, having initially been highly donor driven. But when you look at countries like Ethiopia, Mozambique, Rwanda, elections played no role at all. Here, social protection was institutionalized in response to ideological commitments and a sense of systemic vulnerability. Elites felt threatened. They thought that there was potential for them to be undermined, for stability to be undermined, and their hold on power to be threatened. And they saw social protection as a way to limit their vulnerability and shore up their legitimacy. And this isn't about one settlement being better than another. It's really about how different settlements offer different routes to development. So, for example, our work on maternal mortality and health systems found that 2 countries performed best in our sample, but these were entirely different: Rwanda and Bangladesh. One achieved strong outcomes through a heavily top-down system of accountability and performance management, and the other by opening up to non-state actors in ways that help to work around the damaging effects of what Minister Tunis highlighted, of intense political competition and the short-term incentives that this can generate to misuse public resources and systems for political gain. And finally, under context, our work on state building revealed that, again, 2 different routes were apparent. One involving a concentration of power and a sense of systemic vulnerability, which incentivizes elites to invest in building durable rules-based institutions, with echoes of the East Asian developmental state trajectories here. But the other, a much slower and messier process in competitive settlements where broad social groupings had combined. So what you find in countries like Ghana, and there's not enough of these countries, it has to be said, is that the same often difficult configuration of power with high levels of elite competition have been channeled through particular institutional arrangements that have tamed intra-elite competition and ensured that the politics of patronage isn't, you can't get rid of this, but it takes on a less predatory form, particularly because it's channeled through state structures rather than the more personalised channels that we saw in Uganda and Zambia. And this is somewhat encouraging in identifying a democratic route to state building in contemporary Africa. Historically, it's really difficult to build states and be democratic. You know, we struggle with this. Japan, China struggle with this. France, Spain, US. There's no reason to expect this is going to happen anytime soon or easily in the global south. The second C is capacity. State capacity, we think, is critical and needs to be promoted as vigorously as the other elements of the good governance agenda around accountability and inclusion. Strong states are critical to maintaining order, regulating capital, providing service delivery, and protecting rights. It's the best predictor of whether countries will meet the SDGs, as it was with the MDGs. Now, we found in our work that it's unrealistic to expect states to develop capacity across the board, but we did find very high-performing parts of the state, so-called pockets of effectiveness, that could resist, capture, and deliver development, partly because they deliver to political elites a mixture of both rents and legitimacy that they need at both national and international levels. These are agencies like ministries of finance, central banks, sometimes revenue authorities, other regulatory authorities. And what we found striking here is that there is some good news here, but the way in which international actors have engaged with state building in these areas has been a double-edged sword. We didn't identify high-performing state agencies that hadn't benefited from external assistance, but the highly selective nature of that assistance, whereby certain parts of the state that were required to deliver on a neoliberal policy agenda had been supported, but not those associated with a more transformative development agenda around, for example, supporting ministries of industry, commerce, trade, or planning required to generate jobs and structural transformation. So there's a highly, come back to that in a second, as the problems with that. And our final C is coalitions. In some ways, these pockets of effectiveness are good examples of relatively narrow coalitions of political rulers, senior bureaucrats, and international actors coming together to make deals that enable some parts of the state to flourish and deliver development. But the wider goals of inclusive development involves much broader coalitions across political and civil society, as we saw in efforts to promote higher quality education and women's rights around anti-domestic violence legislation in a whole range of countries. So coalitions are critical, we find, to help navigate the difficult, choppy waters of political settlements, devising institutional fixes and ways to overcome collective action problems. I think stronger support for coalitions and coalition building amongst donors would signal a useful shift away from imposing top-down Western-style solutions in favour of much more flexible, adaptive mechanisms. It might be that country platforms enable this in more aid-dependent countries, but I think we probably need a bit more evidence, as Jonathan has been pushing for, that these platforms can escape the incentives within the aid system to spend large amounts of money on bounded projects that escape fiduciary risk and evaluated against pre-identified criteria. All these sort of paralysing effects of aid as normal would need to be suspended for these to work well, and I'm not sure we see enough of that yet. Last 2 points would be that there might be more one-off arm's length initiatives that donors could think about to help encourage powerful players to engage. This happened in Ghana in the early 1990s. The World Bank supported the Inter-Party Advisory Committee. It sounds like something similar might be happening in Sierra Leone to ensure that informal agreements around the exchange of power are secured alongside the formal rules. I've already flagged the needs for a much more balanced approach to state building and beyond externally driven policy agendas, and in favour of stronger focus on domestic policy agendas and particularly domestic revenue mobilisation as a basis of building resilient states and a wider social contract. And very finally, I think it is important to think about this agenda at multiple levels. African cities are incredibly important to fragility and resilience given the demographics of contemporary African cities. And one thing we're doing with the African Cities Research Consortium now, including within Sierra Leone, is to work with both states and non-state actors to build platforms at multiple levels to bring coalition building together on really complex, politically restricted problems. I'll leave it there and hope we have some time for follow-up, perhaps online rather than in this room. Thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you so much, Sam. Such a rich way to look at a challenge, looking at the political settlements and the fact that different political settlements can lead to different types of results over time, depending on how power is distributed. It was fascinating to hear about how certain crises and risks lead some governments to proactively address this resilience building through social protection and other measures, even when there's not a competitive incentive to do so. They do it as a way of anticipating and trying to build resilience for their own political certainty, but also for broader societal gains as a result. Fascinating to hear as well about the multiple coalitions and the need to build those out as a way of underpinning some of these pockets of effectiveness, but also helping to broaden out some narrow focus there. Vera Songwe, who is the lead of the UN Africa Economic Commission, was recently on a panel for the World Bank and said that while they were trying to support the transition to a civilian government in Sudan, there was a focus amongst multiple partners around trying to remove fuel subsidies in the country to provide more revenue for the government as it moved to a civilian leadership. But this created a lot of tensions within society at the same time that were not fully picked up. And Vera's point was there had been no dissent, there had been no voicing of the possible risk involved in that decision to remove fuel subsidies. And so as the tensions started to build in society, there was no feedback loop for them to then address this risk, which would have been fundamental for resilience. And her point was we need more outside feedback loops to be able to look at risks from multiple points of view. And that for me aligns to your point about how in some cases, a lot of the development community focuses on very narrow objectives of trying to build macroeconomic stability without looking at the knock-on effects to other parts of the risk environment in a particular place. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to turn to Veronica now for her thoughts from a behavioral and social lens, and perhaps from a state legitimacy lens, since you've done so much work on that as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jonathan. And thanks for the invitation. But actually beyond that, thanks for moving along this discussion for a long time now. It's always been very insightful. So yes, you were asking me about a behavior perspective on these things. And I think it's useful to unpack this a little bit because it's very fashionable these days to think about a behavioral perspective or use words like behavioral insights. And it seems often a little bit fashionable and maybe quite removed from discussions about state building. But actually, I think all of the previous speakers have made in one way or another the same point, which is that in all of these things, it is really crucial, important, cannot be replaced by anything else to put humans center stage. I think that's actually, it was actually a quote from Nabila Tunis that I used there, but all speakers have spoken about the importance of humans, whether it's in the language of Sam Hickey just now or as a coalition or in this relationship-based approach that we heard from Hannah Tete. So this is a very important thing to keep in mind, how much humans need to be center stage, but how a behavioral perspective can help us in reminding us of this need is by also using it as a reflective tool on ourselves. And I want to make 2 points on this behavioral lens that we can apply to some of these processes. And one is really the point about what we can imagine to be possible. All of these issues that have been addressed in this panel so far are very complex, very interlinked, very connected and deeply rooted problems, but they all require, and again, I think I'm quoting from Nabila Tunis's talk here, they all require a vision. And what this vision is, what we are as humans able to imagine is what I would call from behavioral lens a mental model. So what is the mental model of what we think the state building approach is trying to achieve? What is being pushed forward? What are the pathways of getting there? And mental models is something that we all have as humans. They help us to kind of function. They help us to interpret a situation, to make sense of what we see around us. They can be very liberating, but they can also be limiting because they are very close to our hearts and we often don't know that we have them. And sometimes they can limit us in the way we assess information. And that is, of course, a real drawback in situations where it's really necessary to continuously assess new information and adapt and broaden our vision of what is possible and what the roles are of humans in these complex processes. The second really crucial aspect of behavioral perspectives on these seemingly often very disembodied processes of state building is that we talked a lot about resilience, and of course inherent in the notion of resilience is an understanding of what risks underpin a particular situation and what risks need to be addressed in order for resilience to be nurtured. And risk assessment is actually a deeply human behavioral process. We all do this in our decision making. We weigh based on the information that we have or want to see what risks we take. And again, I mentioned earlier that it's useful to think of behavioral perspectives as a kind of reflective tool. I think it's a very useful reflective tool for the so-called state builders to say, well, what are actually my own versions of the risk assessment? What are my kind of human perspectives that I bring into assessing the risk that my work creates, but also how I see the risk around me? So how does this behavior perspective link to state building? For me, it's not a big jump, and certainly not as big a jump as it might seem from sometimes these the discussions about state building that can be very kind of process driven, because state building really has a solid mental model that is slowly changing, but it is, Sam Hickey was just mentioning this, it's still often implemented in a very top-down Western style. It's inherent in the language in which it's talked about. It's very much the imagery of a construction ground. State building for a very long time was interpreted as being essentially a construction ground in which institutions based on a kind of architectural top-down blueprint were built and then slowly filled with meaning. That is a very strong mental model, and one that I think really needs replacing, because what the work in the Secure Livelihoods Research Consortium that we've done has told us that this is not how state building works. State building cannot be done on this architectural blueprint. It cannot even be done in the model that was promoted or kind of understood for such a long time, that you can create state legitimacy by delivering services. And the Secure Livelihood Research Consortium, the SLRC, really grappled with this mental model, both theoretically but primarily empirically, to say, but really, is this exchange really working? Does this actually work, that as a state you try to deliver a service and then citizens kind of pay back with legitimacy, and that creates less fragility and less political contestation, and with that less context? And the answer to this is no, because people's experience of the state is much more rooted in their own humanity, in what they expect, and their own mental model of how protected they want to feel by the state, what values they want the state to project, but also maybe how predatory the state has been on them. So actually this issue of service delivery is very, very nuanced. A service might be delivered and it looks okay, but it could be experienced by someone who has felt very alienated, marginalized by a state. There could be important nuances that actually make this moment of service delivery really not functioning as one in which legitimacy is built, but in which the alien relationship is increased. So all of this is, for me, a very interesting entry point into thinking about, well, what does it mean to then have resilient service delivery? Because for me, there is almost like a meta level of coping that is based on the notion of the human experience on this. And it is based on the idea that all of these processes of state building really are about relationships. They are about permanent negotiation between the state and the citizens. And we've heard that from other speakers. And the more this is based on the understanding of where the humans are in this, the more resilient these processes can become, and how we act with each other, how the relationships that are built with each other are developing. That is exactly the adaptive capacity that can then withstand the shocks, whether these are shocks outside the system that enter the system, or shocks within the kind of relationship between the state and citizens. So what can the next steps in this look like? For me, I think it's really crucial to say that a behavior perspective, in the kind of way that I have described it, can help, because it can help us to not just test our mental model, but maybe change it, and change the mental model of state building actively towards the human-centered approach that was championed by previous speakers as the relationship building approach. The behavior perspective also allows us to understand the flawed shortcuts, mental shortcuts that we as humans need to take in a way to function. But once we know about them, we can then also take a step back, reflect on them, and say, are we going wrong because of a way we're assessing the situation as humans? Do we need to adjust this? Do we need to challenge each other? And maybe most crucially, as my last point, is it's often this relational part of all of these state building processes in very political science driven or very practice driven discussions can have also kind of this almost touchy-feely element that not everyone is comfortable with. And I think actually bringing in the often also very quite technical language of a behavior perspective can help taking this discussion, bringing this discussion together to really speak about humans without it sounding maybe in any way detached or unrealistic for these processes that often are presented or viewed as quite technically driven, but really at the heart of them only have humans. So that is what I would see as a very helpful way to move this discussion along. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marijke. That was wonderful. Thank you for elevating some of those key aspects that came from Minister Tunis and Madam Hete, and Sam's emphasis also on the power of ideas in shaping resilient state building and coalitions, not just about hard power interactions or incentives. So the idea of moving from the construction ground metaphor of state building to one that looks deeply relational and networked is very important. I think it's been one of the fascinating and most important pieces of the SLRC work has been trying to break the idea that legitimacy comes from provision of service delivery. And it's a much more narrative, ideological, and experiential, relational process that we're doing. So these are all really critical insights for us. We will be taking all of the insights from all of our distinguished panel today and factoring them into the current work that we're doing in this space of resilient state building. So we deeply appreciate this first panel's engagement with us. And a very warm thank you to the audience for being with us. And please feel free to put comments or questions into the chat. And with that, I will conclude our first panel. Thank you very much, and turn it over to Jonathan for the second.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and thank you very much as well to our first panel. I might actually, before I start the second session, very briefly pick up on the last comments made there by Marijke on the human relationships and the human focus. This is something we've been working on at the Crisis and Fragility team here over the last 18 months. And this month we have published 2 papers which I think speak directly to the issues you've identified. One on the human dimension of fragility, which we're including as a new dimension of analysis in our multidimensional fragility framework. And secondly, there is a look at the outcomes of that we can see through that human dimension. In particular, I commend you to research by Viola Stasayuk on women's outcomes and the effect of the human dimension in fragile contexts on women and girls. So I commend you to both of those, and the links are on our platform. With that, I might just do a quick comms check with our panel. So hopefully, Ozong, you can hear us, and we can hear you. Great. Martin?
Yes, I can hear you very well. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you. Martin?
Yeah, I can hear you. Thank you.
Thank you. And Sharmarke?
Yes, I can hear you, Jonathan.
Thank you very much. Well, with that, I'll get straight through it. Our second panel today focuses on innovating for resilient systems. And for this, I am joined by a truly exceptional panel of guests. Ozong Agborzengaya Fito, Principal Fragility and Resilience Officer at the African Development Bank Group. Martin Alilio, Senior Advisor USAID at the Office of Health Systems Bureau for Global Health. And Sharmarke Farah, who is the Director General of the Somali National Bureau of Statistics. A warm welcome to you all, and thank you for joining us. I will go straight into the questions because I'm a little bit mindful of time, and if I may, I will start with you, Ozong. Through your time at the World Bank, the Islamic Development Bank, and now at the African Development Bank, you've consistently been focused on innovations for resilience in fragile contexts. During that time, what stands out to you most? Sorry, you're still on mute, Ozong. Sorry, if you can just unmute yourself.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you. I heard you well. Greetings, everyone. Let's see, it's been a rich, humbling, fascinating journey, and I've learned a lot along the way. Each of these institutions have a different comparative advantage. For the African Development Bank, I am particularly excited about our work in the Sahel. We're truly seeking to focus and innovate with the G5 Sahel countries and help build resilience by tackling the spectrum of vulnerabilities and fragility. You know the context. It's a region endowed with vast and abundant cultural and natural resources with enormous potential for rapid and inclusive growth to accelerate sustainable development. It has formidable human capital. It's one of the youngest regions, and 65% of the population is under 25 years of age. At the same time, the region continues to suffer the devastating impacts of conflict and violence. More than 2.9 million people, as you know, have been displaced across the region, both within the countries and across borders. The crisis has fragmented community relations as well as the region's social fabric. Another point to add about the context is that an increase in defense expenditures has contributed to an increase in debt levels in this country, in these countries. With regard to gender, the Sahel has some of the largest disparities on the continent, with some of the lowest scores in terms of gender equality, scoring with only 32.4%, where the rest of the region is at 48.6%. This is particularly alarming in a region that is home to a high number of refugees and displaced persons, the majority of whom are women, and who are faced with gender-based violence, high maternal mortality, and other risks to health and well-being. And of course, these risks are aggravated by insecurity, the climate crisis, and malnutrition. Bottom line, the Sahel is characterized by multidimensional structural factors rooted in a combination of governance challenges, competition over natural resources, inequality, and injustice, especially among youth and marginalized communities. So at the African Development Bank, we've identified 5 key areas where we are innovating to build resilience by tackling some of the risks and leveraging the opportunities that exist in the region and at the community level in many of these countries. One is catalyzing private sector engagement. The second is gender equality and empowerment. Third is pushing regional integration. The fourth one is climate change adaptation and mitigation, and the fifth is in the area of governance. The bank has a number of projects in the Sahel, which we refer to as gender marker category 1 projects, which means it is a gender project at the level of impact, and the beneficiaries are 100% women. These are projects in Mali and Chad on literacy and youth entrepreneurship, and we have a regional women's empowerment project. We get a really good feeling at the African Development Bank when we think about women like Nene Maiga. She's a woman, head of household. She's a widow, a mother of 8 children living in Timbuktu in Mali, and who within a year increased her income to 200,000 francs monthly. Now she has bought a plot to build a house. She sent her 2 children to a private school in Timbuktu. She's increased her assets by buying an oven and a freezer, and is now on her way to diversifying her business by bottling local juices. As I mentioned, we're innovating in climate change adaptation and mitigation in the Sahel. The bank has, the African Development Bank has a desert to power solar project that aims to make Africa a renewable energy powerhouse. This initiative aims to stretch across the Sahel region and connect 250 million people with electricity, tapping into the region's abundant solar source. We are also focusing on catalyzing private sector engagement, as I mentioned. We have an initiative called Creating Business Linkages for Local SMEs in the Sahel, by identifying the constraints to SME growth and devising solutions for challenges related to business environment, access to skills, markets, and finance. Fourth, we are strongly pushing and contributing to regional integration. So we have a project to strengthen resilience of agricultural value chains, aiming to improve food security and agricultural productivity. So this is about strengthening economic resilience by supporting regional cooperation on food security and climate change. And finally, even on governance, we have been quite agile and responsive to the needs of governments in the G5 Sahel countries to help them respond to the impacts of the global pandemic by helping with macro and fiscal stability, providing budget support that has enabled these governments to ramp up existing social safety net programs such as cash transfers, feeding, testing, etc. I should say that we're also bringing innovation to resilience in the face of a range of implementation constraints, such as political instability and insecurity, constrained capacity of governance. We are innovating by conducting really strong analytics to sharpen the selectivity of our programming. We are innovating by establishing strategic partnerships for third-party execution and third-party monitoring. For example, we're working with ICRC in Mali. We are innovating by using flexible procurements in difficult environments. So these are some of the ways we're doing things differently at the African Development Bank. I hope that's helpful. Thank you.
That's more than helpful. I mean, it's fascinating on one hand to hear, I mean, how dynamic that situation is that you describe, how complex and challenging it is. And then similarly, the constraints that you operate under. And it I think links back to the previous session and Sam's points about the importance of coalition building. And maybe that's something you can touch on in later questions, because in the midst of all those challenges, there would seem to be some opportunities for that kind of approach. And it would be interesting to hear if that comes out in your work, perhaps something we can touch on in a moment. But now I'd like to turn to Martin, and I guess Martin, you're focused in a very specific sector. So on your experience with health systems, what are the most important features to consider for building resilience?
Thank you, Jonathan. And first of all, I'm extremely honored for the opportunity to join this important panel on behalf of USAID's Office for Health System. Actually, the first panel was really fascinating to me because I work primarily in health sector, and listening to these other sort of points of view around the state, and particularly the state development in Africa, was really, really helpful. So thank you. So this is a timely dialogue, given the current crises that we are facing. It's actually estimated, for example, that as a result of direct and secondary impacts of COVID-19, more than 100 million people will descend into poverty and chronic hunger. Additionally, climate change and conflict will contribute to the increased frequencies and intensity of shocks and stresses that results into humanitarian crises and cause backsliding on an array of development gains, including health sector. This triple threat of COVID-19, climate, and conflict calls for an urgent effort to align humanitarian, peacekeeping, and development assistance to strengthen resiliency of household communities and countries in other areas beyond crises as such. USAID's Global Health Bureau defines resiliency as an ability of people, household communities, and systems and countries to mitigate, adapt, and recover from shocks and stresses in a manner that reduce acute and chronic vulnerabilities, and one that facilitates equitable access to health services. When we talk about health system resilience, we define it as an ability of health system to mitigate, adapt, and recover from shocks and stresses. Actually, a resilient health system can ensure a continuity of existing healthcare and has a capacity to scale up and adapt services to address shocks and stresses. This is really important, the capacity to adapt and stress and continue to provide services even during the stresses. Put simply, therefore, resiliency in health system is the ability to manage adversity and change without compromising future well-being. And it's necessary for communities and countries to emerge from any kind of vulnerability to self-reliance. USAID vision for health system strengthening 2030 provides a framework for how health system strengthening activities can play a foundational help in achieving health resilience. In terms of your question, Jonathan, specifically about the features that are key to building resilience, there's really no magic bullet here, but let me just make a couple of points. Health system resilience cannot be achieved in silos. It needs to be multi-sectoral, a whole society approach that encourages engagement between public and private sector, and also clearly includes civil society. To be resilient, health system must be flexible enough to adjust resources, policy, and focus in response to constantly emerging challenges. USAID recognizes the need to build resilience to acute, sometimes time-bound events such as disease outbreak, as well as the urgency of building long-term dynamics such as population displacement, weak governance and lack of legitimacy, population pressure, social exclusion, and climate variability. So looking at all these sectors is a critical part also of considering what we do in health. In fact, COVID-19 has highlighted the fragility of nations and how systems and sectors are intertwined. Recognizing the interdependencies between education, for instance, governance, food, water, health, environment, and other areas is key premise of what it means to program for resilience. That means addressing vulnerability and shocks as a package. So then what are the key features in this case? The first is ensuring that there is a collaboration and leverage. I think this has been mentioned by almost every panel member in the previous discussion as well. A key issue here is that the collaboration across sectors to leverage resources and enable adaptable healthcare delivery, public health services, policies and priorities to emerging challenges is really a fundamental feature that need to be clearly sort of focused on. The second, of course, is understanding the dynamics and the needs that you're looking at. I think it's not just a question of needs assessment here, but it's acknowledging that there isn't one size that fits all solution to building resilience. And that how you build it must be based on specific conditions of each location, population, and health system. USAID, for that reason, approaches health system from the perspective that they are strengthened sustainably when solutions are locally driven and designed for conditions specific to a given setting, accounting for issues such as gender, youth, disability, and other factors that may influence access to services. The third element that I may just want to point out is capacity to maintain continuity, and this is really key. USAID here focuses on building capacity of countries to maintain continuity of care and basic functioning of health institutions during the response to crisis and recovery from routine stresses such as basic as absenteeism of worker or stock out of commodities to a very large scale shocks in issues such as COVID. But understanding the need to continue maintaining services is really a critical part of the issue here. Then the fourth item, and maybe this will be where I stop, is really something that has been mentioned by just almost every panel member here, and that is the urgency of having a strong and sustainable community systems. Enabling local capacity to identify health system needs and addressing them is a critical, as many countries are increasingly prone to shocks and stress. For example, the impact of COVID-19 in places are experiencing drought or economic downtime, and at the same time, maybe having conflict and other pressures, exemplifies the compound nature of the shocks that the countries are facing. And this really poses a serious challenge in terms of backslide. So building sustainable community systems that have capacity to deal with this issue are one of the key components or feature that need to be looked into. So the fourth key factors, as you asked, Jonathan, is we need to kind of learn how to leverage and work collaboratively, ensuring coordination. There's a critical analysis of needs, ensuring that we're not just providing one solution to fit something else. There's an issue of strengthening capacity to maintain continuity of services when we have challenges. And then there's a strong for developing sustainable community system. Let me stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Martin. I see in one of the comments there in the chat about a reference to what might the building blocks look like for this kind of approach. And I think you've outlined them very well from your perspective of the health sector. I think the other thing that we see from our analysis here is the connectivity that exists between sectors and how dependencies exist between them that may not always be obvious. And I think Ozong touched on them in her opening remarks, where she talked about things like defense spending. But of course, if there's only so much resources to go around, where resources get allocated or prioritized in certain areas inevitably has impacts in others. And then we see how that can reverberate through the kinds of systems that you've discussed. So it's a really revealing insight into how these things can be put together. I think on a positive note, I think we've seen some good examples as well, for example, in the Ebola response, also in the COVID response, that is ongoing, of how systems have adapted and have demonstrated resilience. So there are some examples out there of what good looks like. So it's perhaps again maybe something we can touch on later on in the conversation. I will now move on to a different sector, and one of the main points to be emphasized in the recent final report of the Global Commission on Democracy and Emergencies was the importance of leading with facts that provide evidence-based policy making, strong advisory structures, clear hierarchy of policy objectives, and an open system for consultation with parliaments, opposition parties, and social actors. From your experience in Mali, what are the most important points to consider in building capacity for a national evidence base?
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and thank you to the organizers of this important event. I just want to take you a little bit of a background about the situation in Somalia. So Somalia always had a statistics department since independence in 1960, but over the past three decades, Somalia went through three phases of its national statistical capacity. The first phase was when Somalia's statistical capacity system basically collapsed on the onset of the 1991 civil war, which led to the erosion of this capacity in Somali statistical infrastructure, resulting in large gaps in vital statistics and information for national development. At that moment, in the midst of a severe humanitarian crisis in the early 1990s, and with no government agency to provide data, donors and partners developed their own data generation programs for policy planning and monitoring of social development and humanitarian interventions. An example of this is the Food Security and Nutrition Analysis Unit that was established in 1994 and managed by FAO today. And basically, in essence, in the absence of government, international agencies filled the gap in providing basic services at that time. The second phase was when the government was reconstituted in the mid-2000s. At that moment, a slow rebuilding of the statistical agency was initiated, and over almost a decade, it culminated with the establishment of the Directorate of National Statistics within the Ministry of Planning. So soon as the DNS, or Director of National Statistics, was constituted, an amendment to the Statistics Act was initiated, which brought it in line with the UN fundamental principles of official statistics, including standards of impartiality, equal access, and most importantly, depoliticization of statistics by establishing an independent board of directors that holds the Bureau accountable. And the third and final phase actually came in 2020, when the government passed the amended Statistics Act, which formally established the independent Somali National Bureau of Statistics, which began the process of restructuring and transforming from the Director of National Statistics that was formerly within the Ministry of Planning. In addition to the independence of the board, the amended Statistics Act has clear provisions on the transparency, accountability, use of international professional standards, scientific principles, and professional ethics. The law gave the appointed and highly qualified board and the directors the opportunity to reinvigorate the development of national statistics. Since then, much progress has been made in terms of building statistical capacity and filling the national statistical gaps. Several nationwide household surveys were conducted in recent years, including the Somali Demographic and Health Survey. Some of the data production, however, that were being managed by the international partners were voluntarily returned to the government with appropriate capacity. But in some cases, actually in most cases, such cooperation and collaboration has not been so forthcoming, and I will talk about it later. But a good example, just to demonstrate a good example of such a statistical capacity transfer, is a decade ago, UNICEF collected, analyzed, and disseminated the data from public clinics, hospitals across the country as part of the health management information system. After 4 years of capacity building and through rigorous quality assessment, the government fully assumed responsibility for HMIS. So now government agencies, academic institutions, private sector, and international partners rely on Ministry of Health data, including COVID-19 and COVID-19 information. So when done correctly, like the UNICEF HMIS effort, this shows the transformative impact that could happen within a short period. While also challenges remain in the data sector in Somalia, the Bureau made a recent agreement with FAO on the transfer of the food security and nutrition analysis and the Somali water and land information management unit. So guided by the law and the board of directors, the Bureau also has published recently a user satisfaction survey that included consultations with data users, including the cabinet, parliamentary, the international partners, the public. So this gave us actually further impetus to recommit on the availability and access to information, not only for decision making, but also tracking progress. So that's in a nutshell the progress that that we've made in statistical capacity over the last 30 years or so. Thank you very much, Jonathan.
Thank you very much. And one of the things that jumps out to me from that straight away is we often hear points made about what does good quality ownership look like. And indeed, it was raised in the first panel. And I wonder, is the transition and the experience that you've just described and your transition to a point where where your bureau is coordinating and indeed working alongside organizations like the FAO to get the data and analysis that you need, but very much with your bureau in the lead, if that's a good example of the types of ownership that can be strived for in these kinds of situations, and maybe something you can address in your subsequent questions. I'd now like to go back to Ozong, and I think one of the things, obviously, that we've seen over the last few years has been more and more consensus around the value of the analysis of fragility and the analysis of that balance of risk and coping capacities. We have seen almost all IFIs establish or refresh their fragility strategies over the last couple of years, and including the IMF only in the last few weeks. From the perspective of the African Development Bank, what are the priorities for the next 5 years based on your own strategy? Again, just to check the microphone, please, Ozong.
Thank you, Jonathan. So we have a new strategy. It follows up on the bank's long-standing experience working on addressing fragility and building resilience. And I'm taking the opportunity to express thanks to all of you, including OED colleagues who are part of the consultations and provided input for the successful development of the refresh, the new strategy, as you mentioned. You can find it on our website right now. So we're shifting more robustly to a preventive approach that builds resilience against the diverse shocks and pressures to which the different African regions, countries, and communities are facing. First, the strategy identifies 4 distinct situations along the fragility spectrum, where each situation calls for different forms of support and engagement. The strategy, as many of the other strategy from the IFIs do, recognizes the existence of pockets of fragility, even in middle-income countries. So we're aiming for more regions, more countries, and more subnational areas in Africa to be in a state of resilience. So the strategy actually identifies, defines 3 interconnected and mutually reinforcing priority. So 3. Priority number 1 is about strengthening institutional capacity. Priority number 2 is about building resilient societies. And priority number 3 is about catalyzing private investment. So that's really an area where we want to lean in. There's a theory of change that underpins the operationalization of the strategy and helps to articulate the optimal pathways of maximizing impact on the ground. The theory of change also sets assumptions that underpin risks that, if not mitigated properly, could compromise the implementation of the strategy and the achievement of its objectives. To support implementation, we have pretty much the bank's financial instruments, strategic and operational frameworks, including what we refer to as our high fives and the cross-cutting themes, aim to work in synergy to mainstream resilience considerations across all our operations. The high fives, you mentioned 5, are easy to remember for us. They're to feed Africa, to light up Africa, to industrialize Africa, to integrate Africa, and to improve the quality of life of African people. So we have a number of guiding principles that underpin the bank's work on fragility, that sort of pull the best lessons from what we have been doing. So it's about prevention, as I mentioned before. It's selectivity, it's patience, it's do no harm, it's ownership, which was discussed a lot in the first panel, and it's partnership. We also have some key processes that underpin our work, and it's strong analytics, it's programming, it's also a focus on staffing, a focus on financing, results, and communication. So it's quite an ambitious agenda, but this moment, as you know, calls for that level of ambition.
Thank you. And again, I'm struck by the potential synergies between each of the speakers' presentations, where you're presenting a strategic envelope of options there that can speak to the kinds of transitions from, for example, that we've just heard about in Somalia, and how that can be replicated across different sectors. Of course, that we've heard from a good example we've heard of what a progressive example looks like in Somalia, and the success that they've had there, and how that can kind of fit into that structure. I guess the other side of this is what happens when there's a shock, and how do these processes respond to that? And I think, Martin, if I can come back to you on that, because you mentioned it in your opening comments, when you consider the capacity of a system to respond to a shock, what are the most important factors that you try to build into your approaches there to be able to mitigate shocks when they occur?
Thanks, Jonathan. I'm going to be very brief here, actually, but let me just mention a few factors here. The first, and this is obvious one, is the need to consider the adaptive capacity, absorptive capacity of any given country. In health, for example, this relates to the existing ability of health system to take intentional protective action and to maintain stability in the face of known shocks and stresses in order to prevent or limit the negative impacts. And at this definition specifically, USAID supports countries' health system to implement intermediate actions to effectively manage shock in order to avoid or prevent death and protect their health system while ensuring that they are keeping safety of their own population. So that's one very basic one. The second factor that we look at is of course the ability to adapt. This capacity relates to the ability to make incremental and flexible adjustments in order to better manage the changing situation environment while improving overall system performance. Here, USAID supports particularly interventions that boost system performance in short term. Ideally, they also contribute towards building long-term resilience, but specifically focusing on adapting the emergence challenges, thus helping countries to implement activities that enable some kind of flexibility in their organizational and management system to adjust across the system, but also to link up, as I mentioned earlier, with other sectors. That capacity is very critical. The third, and this is an obvious one again, here will be helping countries to develop some transformers capacity. This is the ability to make fundamental changes in their underlying system, is essentially looking at the contextual systems that need to be modified to allow for that transformation to occur. This typically actually means creating and implementing policies and processes, and sometimes structures that didn't exist before as a way of rebounding from the crisis. So basically, crises tend to produce both challenges and opportunities, and transformation is one opportunity where, for instance, we have seen a lot of changes due to COVID. I think if you look in the past, for instance, the telemedicine or the aspect of using mobile-related communication for providing care was not as central to care provision in most countries. But now, given the crisis is becoming increasingly something that countries are looking at, the use of data to kind of predict where challenges are is increasingly becoming one element that is transforming how services are provided in most countries. So from health systems strengthening perspective in this case, USAID tries to build resilience by linking community structures to health system and coordinating the use of decentralized resources through local government. We have learned that a whole society approach is required to help ensure that we are moving increasingly from resilience to effective response to different crises that are emerging. The critical aspect here is figuring out how to implement the coordination efforts on concrete actions that strengthen institutions for everyday services, such as health, at the same time collaborating extensively with other sectors, which are required in order to ensure that the systems functions. This simply means working with host country stakeholders to strengthen key health system functions from being vulnerable to being critical and to being stable. Thanks.
Thank you. I mean, again, there's some of the themes that are emerging for me here are the importance of managing transitions, the potential of coalitions for doing that and working across systems. I think one of the implicit things are that in what you say is the importance of communication, not just within a sector, but beyond a sector and to different communities. And of course, that brings us to questions of coordination. And if I can come back to you on this, Sharmarka, Somalia obviously has had the country platform as a point of reference in that regard. And we are getting a sense of what it is to build capacity for resilience. But what about the relationship between donors and partners? You've touched on it already earlier on. What are the challenges associated, for example, with collecting data? And the example of the Somali country platform is often cited. What have we learned from its operation today?
Yeah, I think the platform has actually made significant gains, has improved overall partnership and coordination among the government and its partners. We also had a mutual accountability framework, all of that, and actually this has also contributed to somewhat to the statistics. But lately, we've been in a protracted kind of election, so there's been a pause in the country platform in its effectiveness. But if I can just mention, in terms of statistics, the kind of challenges that we've had is that, as I stated earlier, in Somalia, we had a mixture of good and challenging experience in terms of cooperation with international partners and donors. The main challenge in statistics is that much of the data collection is done outside of the government involvement, or it's not, government's not involved. And so, and that also results, obviously, if the statistics agency is not involved, then we cannot generate, official statistics. So Somalia ranks last or near last, actually second last in Africa in terms of reliable statistical indicators and data products. But this is actually of somewhat of a paradox, given that there is a large outpouring of resources into data production by international partners. However, it doesn't make it into official statistics because the National Statistics Agency is not involved, simple as that. So I think we can fill our statistical gaps and our mandate just by actually improving collaboration. But this challenge itself actually raises other more poignant concerns. So the first is that data collected by international partners are normally not published. And even when published, the public view it as the work of others, or they revert to it as today. And even more concerning is that it is viewed with skepticism and sometimes disputed by the government itself because they are not involved. And in the context of in the humanitarian context, there is a serious charge of being not reflecting the facts. Inflated number of people needing food assistance or IDP figures, and that's how basically the public perceive it. And the public perception is that this is done to exaggerate plight for funding reason or something. So in fact, we in Twitter, we get trolled by activists who are asking us to verify this data. Is this data, the humanitarian data, are you involved? Are you, can you verify or at least denounce? So we are put in a difficult situation, as you can imagine. The second is that because data is not shared among partners, there is a duplication of effort and fatigue among the respondents who are constantly being surveyed. And thirdly is that the data that is collected by international partners lacks standard official statistics rigor. So it has quality issues, it has reliability issues, and not to mention the professional, ethical, and the other transparency and accountability that is typical of and enforced by official statistics and the law. So those are the challenges, but obviously progress is being made, but these are the key challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think there are a lot of key messages and thoughts we can take away from today's session, but I think from my perspective, I think if we could package what you've just said and get those messages out there would be really, really valuable, because I think they are issues that we are faced with universally, and if we can get at some of those points, then all the better for donors and partners relationships. And I think that's something that perhaps maybe after the call we can come back to on, because it's definitely an area we're interested in here. I think that so I will come back. We're nearly finished with the final round of questions, but I'll come back to you, Ozong, if I may, for one final question. We've heard about the experience of country platforms. We've heard about the ambition that the African development have in their current fragility strategy. What space do you see for innovation within around the idea of country frameworks, country platforms, and how does it challenge your thinking on how to apply funding in such situations?
So thanks, Jonathan. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, Jonathan, yes. No, thank you. I mean, so for us, context matters, right? So in fragile states where leadership and institutions are weaker, country platforms are likely to look different, on a country by country basis. I mean, it all comes down to procurement and financial management for us, So obviously we want to do more country-led systems, more country-owned, country-driven. So where there are enough checks and balances, and fiduciary processes and tools in place, we're able to do more. So that's just simply the our perspective.
Thank you, and if I may pick up on that then and turn to back to you, Martin. So we've got a sense of what the innovations are. We've got a sense of what the frameworks might be. You're working within a specific sector. What does smart investment look like for you in the health space? What kind of channels work for you in that regard? If you can just unmute yourself, Martin, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and sorry for the mute issue here. This is an important question, actually, because I think internally we believe that investments in health system that benefits all health and diseases not only provide immediate care and improve lives, but also help countries' capacity with their health system to manage pandemics, outbreaks, and other health emergencies. So a broad scope investment that covers health system as a whole as opposed to a specific micro sector like one specific disease is key issue here. So increasing the use of government to government and local partners agreements is one thing that we have seen that bolsters local efforts, particularly, and encouraging people to participate in the health sector. So the right approach to build back better, I think in this case, depends on particular health system, but actually the involvement of local partners, which is being mentioned here over and over again, I think is a critical part of it. But also it's sort of a more broader investment, cross-cutting aspect of health system that's critical here. Maybe to amplify this, allow me to use a few examples here. So in the past 10 years, for instance, the conflict in northern eastern Nigeria has exacerbated fragility at the community level through displacement of people and is contributing to the deteriorations of health services and breakdown of public services. Actually, with 50% of health facilities in this region being non-functional and 40% fully destroyed by civil conflict, the primary health care is a really challenge in this case. And gender-based violence, clinical management, and provision of reproductive health services are lacking, or in some cases seriously inaccessible, or very, very seriously under-resourced. So to respond to this type of fragility, USAID, working jointly with UK's government, Foreign Commonwealth Development Office, are using a conflict-sensitive approach with focus on do no harm to constitute and support, to reconstitute, this is a key word, to reconstitute and support primary healthcare facilities. The programs enables the health system to continue providing essential services, particularly to the marginalized groups like women and girls, so that people in these communities can address and mitigate other forms of fragility. So helping to fix the health system and health services problem as a way or a path to addressing other problems within this community. Similarly, in Democratic Republic of Congo, USAID programming focuses on community resiliency and self-reliance that creates a space for working across humanitarian development and peace building and access. USAID funding expands access to quality health services in public and private sector facilities and support other sectors such as water and sanitation. The support also helps government to build early warning system to detect and respond to disease outbreak. Sequencing, layering, and integration of human and development assistance is used as a key approach in these efforts in DRC. The support is facilitating the citizen to government engagement to build public trust, empowering communities, expanding institutional capacity, and system actors to engage with and drive reforms in their own country, including by identifying common understanding of root causes of conflict, both within and between communities. Through conflict and system analysis, dialogue, trauma awareness, and civil society strengthening and other community-based initiatives, USAID is contributing to help the government of Democratic Republic of Congo advance its own strategy of women, peace, and security, which is key, part of their efforts internally. I should also mention here that last year, as I said earlier, as a key aspect of the health system vision that we launched, the most important aspect is this issue of coordination between global efforts, national and subnational levels to maintain progress today that we have. Often the linkages between global effort and national and subnational levels has been very weak, and it's an area where we really need to invest more effort in ensuring that at least the national capacities, in some areas, things called in some areas this called district authorities or municipal authorities are really critical in creating stability in health system, but they are often not as a key focus of attention, particularly by international donors as they should. The vision, our vision calls for global effort to rethink how we provide technical assistance and how we can do so in a way that fosters the capacity and locally generated solutions through intentional coordination and collaboration between these levels. But also intentional collaboration between health security, which is something that is much more within the realm of public health, and health system actors, which is much more within the realm of providing care. So linking public health interventions that deals with outbreaks with the care provision is the critical part of solution that we see as a key issue. It's also, the strategy particularly that I was speaking with calls for a community, the transition from just reacting to emergencies, which has been the fundamental way the global community does, to moving also beyond preparedness, which is something that we talk about often, to directing our attention towards fostering everyday resilience. And everyday resilience here means really having the system that's able to withstand shocks of any kind. And this can only be done by ensuring that the local institutions are optimal and working. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Again, one of the things that jumps out from that is the importance of the right data and the right analysis being matched with the right investment and the being the fuel of all those kinds of responses that you've just outlined. Picking up on that, then, Shamark, if I can come back to you. So we've heard about a very sector-specific example, and we've heard there about the demands at district level for technical assistance for that transition from preparedness to resilience. So what do you need to be able to provide the information to help those kinds of processes and the decisions that underwrite them? What kind of investment do people involved in statistics need to be able to move in tandem with the ambition that we see across other sectors?
Thank you very much. Now, so just to first of all outline, before I get into the specifics of what the types of investment that is actually necessary for state capacity, I just want to highlight the importance of investing in statistics. So I actually believe that data collection and analysis and dissemination is the cornerstone of state resilience, state building also, and state capacity. So the state of national statistical capacity is a good indicator of the state's and resilience. So the more the government is able to produce reliable data, the more likely it is to be making the right decisions, and thereby act effectively and serves its citizens. So as such, investment in the statistical capacity should be prioritized not only by international partners, but also by domestic revenue. Fortunately for us, the Ministry of Finance has quadrupled our budget allocation for the last couple of years since the establishment of the Autonomous Statistics Bureau. And also official statistics promotes government ownership, accountability, also facilitates more effective government-led prevention, response, solutions to efforts, and so on. And data and evidence can also contribute to state commitment and political will, contributing to state capacity to address humanitarian and development priorities. Actually, the investment that is actually needed in our case is actually outlined in our national statistics development strategy. It was a 5-year plan, and there is mostly, the key area is actually generating information. And there are some other support areas in the ICT, because we are using ICT as a way to sort of leapfrog, the advances, using, as a means of leapfrogging in using the advances in technology. So, and one of the important things that this really actually has is that it is not only important for partners and the government, but also investment in statistics is also important for mobilizing private sector and diaspora, especially in Somalia during humanitarian crisis. So in Somalia has a thriving and generous private sector that coordinates with the government on responses during drought and flood. In 2017, for example, the private sector and diaspora donated more than 5 million in cash and about double that in kind for one of the regions one of the regions that was affected by a drought at that time. One of the 18 regions, actually. It was Gedo region at that moment. And the private sector and the diaspora response would benefit from high quality government data for early warning and also targeting the most needy, which would ultimately promote ownership and state efficiency. So those are the kind of the importance, and actually also the kind of investment that is needed. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shamarka. Again, a really fascinating insight into a particular sector and how its value is so important, way beyond its own immediate operations. So thank you for giving us some insight to that. Before concluding this panel and today's session, and to provide some context on why the ideas we've heard today speak directly to the effectiveness of policies in fragile contexts, we'll play a short video now addressed from the Director of Development Cooperation Directorate at the OECD, Mr. George Maria da Silva, and after which I will bring the session to a close. So just play the video now shortly. Thank you.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the OECD and our partner for this event, Food for the Hungry, I would like to thank all of the participants who contributed to our exceptional panels today. As was highlighted during the recent World Bank Fragility Forum, development assistance works in all and for fragile contexts. But the development community faces a daunting challenge. We are living through an era of successful global shocks, economic, health, climate, and most recently, a conflict of massive geopolitical significance in Ukraine. The challenges are not just immense and enduring, they are also dynamic, requiring resources to be reallocated at an increasingly short notice to where they are needed most. Progress on the majority of the Sustainable Development Goals in fragile context has stalled. On current trends, even before COVID-19, some 80% of the world's poorest will live in fragile context by 2030. Innovation is no longer a choice if we are to address the ongoing impact of issues such as war, pandemics, and the rising impact of climate change, energy security, food insecurity, and forced displacement. Innovation is a requirement for survival. Adapting our approaches to build resilient systems and states is essential if we are to respond effectively to the challenges that exist in fragile contexts. This is not an easy task. Compound and complex risks characterize today's fragile context, highlighting the necessity to preempt, prepare for, and work to prevent, mitigate the root causes and drivers of fragility. Yet, most assistance in fragile contexts remains focused on meeting human needs, not on addressing complex risks that continuously lead to crises and disrupt the development and state building agenda. New and emerging policies have a great potential to drive more effective actions for building resilience in fragile contexts. The United States and the European Union have developed major strategies to build resilience in fragile contexts. The World Bank, the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the United Nations have all developed new fragility and resilient assessment tools, frameworks, and financing instruments which can be applied to resilient state building. The World Health Organization and USAID have pioneered efforts for resilient health systems in fragile contexts and resilient education systems. The Food and Agriculture Organization is supporting resilient food systems, and IMF has an emerging focus on macroeconomic resilience. To support these efforts, the OECD guidance on resilient systems analysis provides one of the few much needed macro level frameworks on risks and coping capacities. Moreover, the OECD's States of Fragility platform provides an essential evidence base highlighting multidimensional fragility and resilience across the 57 fragile contexts. We also know that to be effective in fragile contexts, we need to get the policy and the politics right. The evidence and experience from contexts such as Afghanistan and the Sahel highlight why conflict-affected fragile contexts require better joined-up approaches to development and peace if truly resilient systems are to emerge. Better approaches to development cooperation and conflict prevention are essential for building positive peace. The OECD DAC recommendation on the humanitarian development peace nexus provides a valuable framework linking development, diplomatic, and political options for fragile contexts to support sustainable development and peace. As funds flow to support Ukraine, we must be smart in making investments that balance dire humanitarian needs with medium and longer term support for the resilience of people impacted in the region and beyond. In closing, while there are no illusions about the universality of fragility and the scale of tasks we face in fragile contexts, there is a distinct momentum that donors and partners can leverage to strengthen resilient systems for those that need them most in fragile contexts. I thank you.
So with thanks to our director for delivering that message. Jonathan, we've certainly covered a lot of ground today. In reflecting on the scale of the challenges outlined just now by the director, it's fantastic to hear the ideas we've heard in both sessions today, I think, and how they've been applied in fragile and conflict-affected contexts. And it's also encouraging to see the range of innovations that we've heard about today. Later this year, I should say that we will be publishing the next States of Fragility report, which will revisit many of these themes that we've heard. And until then, I encourage you all to check the OECD's work on this and other areas relevant to fragile contexts by visiting our States of Fragility web platform. This now includes our research published this month on human dimensions of fragility and how fragile contexts affect the well-being and potential of women and girls. And with that, I would like to thank all the panelists who've joined us today for giving so generously of their time. I would also like to thank our partners for the event at Food for the Hungry and our team here at the OECD for their support and guidance. This brings our session to a close. Thank you all for joining us, and wherever you are, we wish you a pleasant day.
Thank you, everyone.